Yeah, so anyway, today's stream I'm going to be going through each mode in turn, so starting with Splat Zones, ending with Clan Blitz, of course. And we're going to be going over just some basics for how to think about the mode, some fundamentals, as we were informed the West is in dire need of the other day. And so we're going to start each little section with some going over the fundamentals. And I'm going to teach you how you can go over the fundamentals for yourself. So I'm not going to be able to go over every single thing that makes up the way these modes play. I'm just going to equip you guys with the knowledge that is required to do this for yourselves. And I'm also going to go through, obviously, some important things. Otherwise, it would be a little bit too abstract for my liking. And once we're done, so I think the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go through all 4 modes, and then we're going to do the finals. So I've picked out a couple of games for each mode. Zones, unfortunately, I only really got the one mode that was particularly interesting. But, so we're going to be going over Sayonara versus Astral for Splat Zones. We're going to be going over In Control versus Polaris Game 2 for TC. And we're also probably going to take a look at XLSX versus Pufferfish for TC. Though that's on TC Pit, and a lot of the stuff I want to talk about on TC Pit happens in the finals anyway, so we might just skip that. For Rainmaker, we're going to talk about Sayonara versus Astral. Sayonara versus Astral are 2 Rainmaker games, and I want to talk about both of them. And finally, for Clan Blitz, we're going to talk about KP versus Demise on the Reef, the one where there was that crazy 100-0 push where Demise went in and KP went in at the same time, and KP got there first and then just started scoring. That was a terrible game. I'm sorry, but I really didn't like anything about that game, and I'm going to break down exactly why once we get to it. Then, after we've done all that, we're going to talk about the finals themselves, and we're going to talk about essentially the way that the finals played out. Astral had 0 control over the result of that finals. That finals was Demise winning 6 games, Demise losing 6 games, and Astral maybe winning 1 game. Astral essentially was spectating the finals and just watching as Demise either just coin flipped to decide whether they're going to win the game or not. So that is how... What the hell? Oh my gosh. These notifications on OBS are so annoying. Haven't dropped a frame in 10 minutes and it's just constantly spamming with whatever. Do I have the link for the Tic Tac stream at Pixie Monsters versus KP? I don't have it on me, unfortunately. If you watch the VOD of my stream... Oh, well, I mean, you can just... Hang on. You can find the VOD on that channel. That is Rado's channel. And you can check the past broadcasts to find the VOD of it. Hopefully he's actually saved it. It was only a couple of days ago, so it should still be there. So yeah. Where was I? So we're going to look at the finals. We might not look at all the games. We might just look at the games that Demise lost, because a lot of the games. Actually, we'll see. We'll see how we're going on time. There are 13 games to go through, and I have a tendency to waffle on, so we probably won't go through all the final games, but we'll go through at least the games that Demise lost. And essentially, the point that I'm going to be making is that Demise was in complete control of all those games, including their losses, and it was down to whether or not Demise threw the game that Astral won. Though I think there was only one game where Astral actually did something to win the game that Demise couldn't beat, and aside from that, it was Demise winning, oops, we threw, Astral wins. And, of course, by that, what I'm implying is that Demise is a significantly better team than Astral, aside from the part where they lose half their games just because they don't understand fundamentals. So, hopefully, by the end of this stream, you'll understand some of the fundamentals that, if you were in Demise's position, perhaps you could have actually won the crown. So anyway, we're going to start with Splat Zones, as you would expect. Actually, no, we're going to start with just a couple of starting points, first of all. So how are we going to look at fundamentals when you're learning any game, not just Splatoon? How do you actually go about figuring out fundamentals? Also, hi to the people who are joining in chat. I'm not going to talk too much to you guys at this point, just because I want to like get through this stuff and get some momentum going. So the first thing is we're going to decide on 3 questions that we're going to ask every time we come to something new about the game. So we've got 3 questions. The first one is, how do we control the objective? Right? We're going to be starting essentially from scratch. We're actually going to start with 0 game knowledge, not even understanding how the objective works. And we're going to build up to some interesting and useful strategies just from that alone. So first one, how is the objective controlled? That is to say, how do you... like, what do you do with the objective? The objective is just something in the middle of the map, and how do you influence the objective? Second thing is, how does the objective change over time? So once you're controlling the objective, how does the state of that objective change? And as we'll see in Splat Zones, it's not just about how it changes, but also how it doesn't change. And thirdly, how do you win a game? What is your end goal? So this will include, for pretty much every mode, it's basically just going to be, get the 100-point knockout or have the most points at the end. When you're thinking about these kinds of questions, what you need to be doing is you need to employ a couple of strategies to make sure that you aren't just sort of tunnel visioning on the objective or the question or whatever. So you need to be approaching it from a number of different angles. So obviously the first one is to just directly answer the question, how is Splat Zones how is the zone in Splat Zones controlled? Well, you paint it. But then once you start unpacking the answers to these questions, you have to start thinking about about what you're doing in a couple of different ways. And there's 2 main things that you should be doing that are, if you're familiar at all with the scientific method, you might find them familiar. The first one is that you should always... whenever you get stuck, you should always try to invert the problem. And by that I mean, if you can't figure out how to do something, you can try to figure out how to do the opposite of that thing. How do we win on Splat Zones? Don't know. How do we lose on Splat Zones? Maybe we can come up with some things there. Another option, another way of looking at that is like, okay, how do we defend against a push on this mode on Rainmaker? Well, we don't know yet, so how about we figure out how we can utterly fail a defense on Rainmaker on this mode? And what you'll find is that by inverting the problem like this, you'll be able to figure out some of the things that are important, and then you can sort of invert backwards and start to figure out, this is important, so maybe it's going to be useful for our defense, and then you can start to figure out how to actually do it correctly. The other thing is to try to undermine every single assumption and premise that you have in your answer. So an assumption would be something like, so we had in the Rado VOD review that Bamboozler wins straight-up fights against shooters, that it counters the sort of shooter class. So in that you have the assumption, first of all, that the bamboo hits their shots. What happens if the bamboo misses? That's an assumption that you can question. Likewise, you can undermine the actual premise as well. The Bamboozler wins straight-up fights. What if a fight isn't straight up? What if it's an unfair fight? And by asking these kinds of questions, you can start to understand the way, the importance of things like statements like bamboo counters, win straight up fights against shooters, and then you can also start to come up with ways to get around that statement. So how do you, like, if your entire team is countered by a charger, then maybe you can come up with a way of undermining the whole premise of being countered by a charger. Another thing is you should try to clarify all these things. So when we're talking about like Bamboozler wins straight up fights against shooters, what does it actually mean to win a straight up fight? What does it mean that every time it walks toward a shooter, the shooter dies, or does it just mean that the shooter has to walk away every time the Bamboozler approaches? Does it mean that the Bamboozler will never actually be threatened by the shooters, but the shooters also aren't necessarily threatened by the Bamboo? Like, you can see what I mean by there's a bunch of different ways to interpret this, and you can question just about every part of any like statement that is being made to figure out why it's important. So what does it mean to win a fight? Why is it winning that fight? And also, why are shooters specifically counted? Why are other classes of weapons not necessarily counted? And while you're doing this, though, it's also important to make sure you're going for a sort of a middle ground on this. You're not trying to make everything wrong. You're not trying to get too negative. So there's a thing called negativity bias, where people are generally more likely to believe something that is sort of negative in nature. And so you want to make sure that you aren't sort of falling victim to that as well. So, you shouldn't be thinking... Like, it's really easy to trick yourself into thinking, oh, you can't beat Bamboo with L3 because it's like one of those sort of negative things, or Frontline is dead because that's like a very negative, like it's something in the negative rather than something like, Frontline can be used, Frontline can still work. It would be a positive thing. Frontline is dead would be a negative thing. People are generally more likely to agree with Frontline is dead because it's a negative thing. It's a negativity bias. Yes, it also explains why conspiracy theories exist and all that sort of stuff. Negativity bias is really interesting. Biases in general are really interesting, but I don't want to get